concerns were highlighted by his fight against corruption in the federal government and by his efforts to solve national financial problems. He believed in a government which only intervened to protect individual liberties and freedoms. Theodore Roosevelt became our 26th president when President William McKinley was assassinated in 1901. His accomplishments include the breaking up of big business monopolies and more conservation of natural resources. Teddy Roosevelt summarized his foreign policy as "speak softly and carry a big stick." He was elected president on his own in 1904. The Nobel Prize for Peace was awarded to Roosevelt in 1906, after he brought the opponents in the Russian-Japanese War to a peace agreement. In 1912, he unsuccessfully ran for president as the candidate of the Progressive Party. Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president, was a Southerner who had seen the horrible effects of the Civil War and tried desperately to keep America out of World War I. In fact, his re-election slogan in 1916 was, "He kept us out of war." After Germany violated the neutrality of the United States, Wilson reluctantly asked Congress for a declaration of war, and Congress approved. After a long and bitter and bloody battle, America helped the Allies defeat the Germans and end World War I. He helped form the League of Nations, a predecessor of the current United Nations. In 1920, he received the Nobel Prize for Peace. Our 32nd president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was elected 4 times. He held the office of the presidency for over 12 years, longer than anyone else in history. Roosevelt first took office during the Great Depression in 1933. At his inauguration, he assured the public that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. The early part of his presidency is remembered for his New Deal policies. These were Roosevelt's government programs designed to relieve the effects of the Depression. December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed the naval base at Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt urged Congress to declare war, and with their approval, the nation entered World War II. Just a few weeks before Germany surrendered, and before the end of the war with Japan, President Roosevelt died. Franklin Delano Roosevelt would be remembered by many as a great social activist and a symbol of American leadership. During the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, our 34th president, America lived in prosperous times. During his first term in the 1950s, Ike, as he was known, ended the Korean War. During his second term, however, Eisenhower faced an escalation of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and terminated diplomatic relations with Fidel Castro's Cuban government. The youngest person ever elected president was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He was 43 years old, and he was also the only Roman Catholic ever elected. In his inaugural address in 1961, he challenged the nation.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Although his election was greeted with great optimism, his administration began with the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba by CIA-trained Cuban rebels attempting to oust the communist dictator Fidel Castro. In October 1962, the world came as close as it ever would to a nuclear war. On learning that the Soviets were installing missiles in Cuba, Kennedy imposed a blockade, and he ordered Soviet Premier Khrushchev to remove the weapons. The whole world held its breath. After many tension-filled days, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles, and war was averted. The John F. Kennedy presidency was cut short. He was assassinated on November 22, 1963. Kennedy, our 35th president, is best remembered as a visionary, a man who encouraged millions of Americans to strive to be their best. Following Kennedy's death, Lyndon Johnson became our 36th president. Known for his political skill, Johnson guided many of Kennedy's projects through Congress, including the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of many civil rights bills that he signed into law. Johnson also started his own set of domestic policies known as the Great Society, and he declared a war on poverty. Unfortunately, his administration would be remembered most for the Vietnam War. During his terms in office, American military presence in Vietnam escalated from 16,300 Americans back in 1963 to 500,000 by 1968. Greatly frustrated by the difficulties over the war in Vietnam, Johnson declined to run for re-election in 1968. Richard Milhous Nixon became our 37th president in 1969. Among the best remembered events of his presidency were his visit to China. Nixon was instrumental in ending the war in Vietnam. Another well-remembered event of his presidency, American astronauts landing on the moon. During his 1972 re-election campaign, members of his re-election committee were caught breaking into Democratic campaign headquarters in the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. The Watergate scandal that followed brought down the Nixon presidency.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
Facing impeachment from the House of Representatives, Nixon resigned the presidency on August 9, 1974, something no other president has ever done. The 40th President of the United States was Ronald Reagan. He called for a period of national renewal and a resurgence in American pride. Early in his Republican administration, he persuaded a Congress controlled by Democrats to increase spending on defense and to reduce taxes. During the 1980s, inflation dropped and the economy thrived, but trade and budget deficits occurred. In 1984, he was elected to a second term in office, making him the oldest person ever elected president at the age of 73. The Reagan administration survived the Iran-Contra scandal in 1986, in which profits from arms sales to Iran were illegally sent to resistance fighters in Nicaragua. Reagan denied any knowledge of the covert operation. Ronald Reagan is widely considered very influential in ending the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union, and he left office a highly popular president in 1989. Thomas Jefferson called the presidency a splendid misery, and few who have held that office would disagree. Although it is a great honor to become President of the United States, the office holds many burdens and many pitfalls. Our most successful presidents have been men who provided strong leadership in times of crisis, men who administered the government as a true statesman, and who followed the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, protecting the rights of all Americans. When a new president is elected, we witness once again the peaceful transfer of power, often from one political party to another. We see the power and the wisdom of the Constitution at work. For over 200 years, it has served the people and will continue to do so as long as the President obeys and upholds the oath of office that he takes before all the citizens of the United States of America.